Good morning. Today we are going to be learning about proving lines parallel. So we're going to be working with 4 different converses that help us prove lines parallel. So the first one is going to be our corresponding angles converse. So corresponding angles, just a reminder, are going to be when we have a transversal going through 2 lines. It's going to be same position. So angles 2 and 6 are going to be corresponding. 3 and 7 are going to be corresponding. 1 and 5 are corresponding, and then 4 and 8 are corresponding. So the corresponding angle converse tells us if 2 lines are cut by a transversal so that corresponding angles are congruent, then the lines are parallel. So our first example, if angle 1 is congruent to angle 5, so angle 1 and angle 5 are congruent, then we can say line L is parallel, that's our symbol for parallel, 2 lines side by side. Line L is parallel to line M. So if angles 1 and 5 are congruent, then these 2 lines are going to be parallel. We can say the same thing for each pair of corresponding angles here. So if angles 2 and 6 are congruent, these 2 lines are parallel. 3 and 7 are congruent, these 2 lines are parallel. And 4 and 8 are congruent, these 2 lines are parallel. Alternate interior angles converse is going to tell us if 2 lines are cut by a transversal so that alternate interior angles are congruent, then the lines are going to be parallel. So when we look at our picture, alternate interior angles, alternate opposite sides of my transversal, and then interior inside those 2 lines, and then it needs to be non-adjacent. So looking at this picture, we have 2 pairs of alternate interior angles, angles 3 and angles 5, angles 4 and 6. So our example for this one, if angle 4 is congruent to angle 6, so 4 and 6 have the same measure, then we know line L is parallel to line M. Alternate exterior angles converse tells us if 2 lines are cut by a transversal so that alternate exterior angles are congruent, then the lines are going to be parallel. So looking at our picture, alternate opposite sides of our transversal, exterior outside these 2 lines, so it's going to be up here or down here, and then they need to be non-adjacent, so not sitting beside each other, not sharing a common vertex or a common side. So we have 2 pairs of alternate exterior angles, angle 1 and angle 7, angle 2 and angle 8. So for our example, if angle 2 is congruent to angle 8, so if they have the same measure, then we know line L is going to be parallel to line M. So if these 2 angles have the same measure, these 2 lines are going to be parallel. Consecutive interior angles converse. So consecutive interior angles converse is going to be slightly different than the other ones because we know that consecutive interior angles are not congruent, they are supplementary. Supplementary means they add up to 180 degrees. So our consecutive interior angles converse tells us if 2 lines are cut by a transversal so that consecutive interior angles are supplementary, then the lines are going to be parallel. So when I look at my picture up here, consecutive, it's going to be on the same side of my transversal, interior inside those 2 lines. So looking here, I have 2 pairs of consecutive interior angles. I have angle 4 and 5 and angles 3 and 6. So for our example, if the measure of angle 3 plus the measure of angle 6 equals 180 degrees, then we know line L will be parallel to line M. Alright, so we are going to go over example number 1 together. So for this problem, you are given the following information. We need to determine which lines, if any, are parallel, and then state the converse that justifies your answer. So number 1A is giving us angle 2 is congruent to angle 4. So we're going to look at our picture. Angle 2 and angle 4. So my transversal cutting through those 2 angles is going to be line A. And if angle 2 and angle 4 are congruent, that is going to tell me that lines C and D are parallel. So line C is parallel to line D. And the converse that told me that is going to be my corresponding angles converse, because angle 2 and angle 4 are corresponding angles. And if 2 corresponding angles are congruent, then we know those 2 lines are going to be parallel. corresponding angles converse. Angle 5 is congruent to angle 10. So I'm going to look at my picture. I have angle 5 here and angle 10 here. So my transversal cutting through those two angles is going to be line C, and the two lines that cut through are A and B. And my angle relationship between angle 5 and 10, opposite sides of my transversal, inside lines A and B, non-adjacent. So they're going to be alternate interior angles. So the parallel lines are going to be A and B. A is parallel to B, and we know that because angles 5 and 10 are congruent and they are alternate interior angles. So alternate interior angles converse. Measure of angle 6 plus measure of angle 10 equals 180 degrees. So we have angle 6 and angle 10 that are supplementary. They add up to 180 degrees. So looking at my picture, line C is going to be my transversal once again, cutting through lines A and B. Your transversal can never be your parallel line. So A and B have angles 6 and 10 on them, and they're going to be same side of my transversal inside those two lines. So they are going to be consecutive interior angles. And if I know that two consecutive interior angles add up to 180 degrees, then I know those two lines are going to be parallel, that transversal cuts through. So line A is parallel to line B because of our consecutive interior angles converse. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 14. So looking at my picture, I have angle 1 up here and angle 14 down here. So those are going to be opposite sides of their transversal outside those two lines. So they're going to be alternate exterior angles. If two alternate exterior angles are congruent, we know the two lines are going to be parallel. So line A and line B will once again be parallel, and we know that because of our alternate exterior angles converse. Measure of angle 14 plus measure of angle 15 equals 180 degrees. So I have these two angles here that are supplementary. So line B will be my transversal. They're on the same side of that transversal inside those two lines that it's cutting through. So those are going to be consecutive interior angles. And if two consecutive interior angles add up to 180 degrees, we know that the two lines they cut through are going to be parallel. So line C is parallel to line D because of consecutive interior angles converse. Angle 11 is congruent to angle 16. So I have angle 11 here and angle 16. So those two angles do have a relationship, but it's not going to be any of the four we have been working with today. So those two angles are vertical angles. They are across from each other. So we cannot prove two lines are parallel using vertical angles. So we are going to write none. And we don't need to put a converse in because we are not using one. Angle 4 is congruent to angle 15. Angle 4 is here, angle 15 down here. So those two are going to be opposite sides of their transversal, which is line D, outside the two lines it's cutting through. So those are going to be alternate exterior angles. So if I have two alternate exterior angles that are congruent, I know these two lines that it cuts through are going to be parallel. So line A, parallel to line B because of my alternate exterior angles converse. Angle 10, congruent to angle 12. So I have angle 10 here and angle 12 here. So my transversal, line B, and they're going to be in the same position, that top right position. So those are going to be corresponding angles. If two corresponding angles are congruent, we know the two lines that they cut through are going to be parallel. So lines C and D will be parallel, and that is due to corresponding angles converse. Measure of angle 9 plus measure of angle 13 equal 180 degrees. So we have angle 13 out here and angle 9 right next to it. So yes, Those two are right next to each other and they form a nice linear pair and are supplementary, but we cannot prove any lines parallel with them because they only can be our consecutive interior angles that are supplementary in order to prove them. So these two are forming a linear pair, but they are not telling us any lines are parallel. So that one is going to be none. We don't need a converse there. Angle 2 is congruent to angle 7. So I have 2 here and 7 here. Opposite sides of my transversal, inside those two lines that it's cutting through, non-adjacent. So those are going to be alternate interior angles. So if those two alternate interior angles are congruent, we know those two lines are going to be parallel. So line C is going to be parallel to line D. And that is because of our alternate interior angles converse. And then our last one, angle 6 is congruent to angle 11. So I have angle 6 here and angle 11 here. Those two angles, automatically, I know there's no relationship because I do not have a line cutting through those two angles that connects. There's no transversal there. So automatically I know that is going to be none.